The ozone metallic tang of the currency counter always burned the back of my throat. It was a specific scent, a mixture of friction-heated rubber belts, static electricity, and the deeply ingrained grime of a million different hands, mixed with the sharp, acidic sting of cocaine residue trapped in the fibers of the $50 bills. The air in the basement of the meatpacking plant was suffocating. I sat under the harsh glare of a single industrial fluorescent bulb, the hum of the ventilation system a low, steady vibration against my wingtip shoes. My fingers were black with ink and dirt. I did not wash them, not until the count was verified, not until the ledger was balanced. The machine spat the final stack of bills into the tray with a rapid, staccato clapping sound. I reached out, my thumb running along the crisp edge of the paper. Exactly $10,000. I wrapped a rubber band around the stack, the snap echoing off the damp concrete walls. I added it to the wall of green and grey building up on my left. $2.4 million. A light week for the Moretti family. I reached across the stainless steel table, the surface freezing against my forearms, and pulled the ledger toward me. It was not a digital file. Donatello Moretti did not trust servers, clouds, or encrypted hard drives. He trusted leather. He trusted paper. The black book was a thick, heavy tome bound in untreated calfskin that smelled of cedar oil and stale Tuscan cigars. Its pages were thick, rough-edged parchment. This book held the absolute truth of Chicago's underworld. It documented every shell corporation in Delaware, every bribed alderman in the First Ward, every union kickback, and every life bought and paid for over the last 40 years. I uncapped my Mont Blanc fountain pen. The nib scratched against the thick paper, a sound like a dry razor on skin. I logged the 2.4 million. I logged the routing numbers for the offshore accounts in the Caymans. I blew gently on the ink, watching the wet, midnight blue sheen dry to a dull, permanent black. My breathing was slow, perfectly matched to the rhythm of the exhaust fan above me. I was a creature of absolute precision. Precision was the only armor a man like me had in a world governed by blunt force trauma. I turned the page to update the weekly disbursement for the sanitation union. As the thick paper flipped over, something caught the sterile light of the bulb. A microscopic aberration. The binding of the black book was hand-stitched with heavy wax thread. I knew every knot. I knew the exact tension of the spine. But the seam between page 214 and 215 was loose, just a fraction of a millimeter. The wax thread was frayed, the microscopic fibers standing on end. Someone had opened the binding. Someone had inserted a new page. The temperature in the basement plummeted. The chill seeped through my tailored wool suit, biting into my ribs. The rhythmic hum of the ventilation system suddenly sounded like a roaring freight train in my ears. I placed the Mont Blanc pen down on the steel table. The metal clip clicked sharply against the surface. My hands were perfectly still, but the muscles in my jaw locked tight enough to crack my molars. I did not flip directly to the new page. I traced the edge of the paper with my index finger, feeling the slight difference in the grain. The parchment was a shade lighter, lacking the yellowed patina of the surrounding leaves. The smell of cedar oil was weaker here, masked by the faint, chemical odor of fresh binding glue. I turned the page. I turned another. I moved methodically toward the back of the ledger, my pulse maintaining a flat, deceptive calm, while my stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. The back pages of the black book were reserved for debts that could not be settled with currency. They were the execution orders, the final tallies. I reached the last page, the new page. The ink was black, written in the heavy, aggressive script of Donatello Moretti. There were no dates. There were no elaborate explanations. There was only a list of 3 names. The first was Anthony Russo. Anthony had been the capo of the South Side crew. His body was found 3 days ago in the trunk of a burned-out Cadillac near the rail yards. The official police report cited a dispute over gambling territory. The second was Marcus Thorne. Marcus was an independent contractor, a cleaner who had gotten sloppy with a union hit last month. He disappeared on a Tuesday. He never resurfaced. The third name was Arthur Pendleton, I stared at the letters of my own name. The wet ink seemed to sink into the parchment, pulling my oxygen down with it. The smell of the basement changed. The ozone and the money faded, replaced by the overwhelming metallic stench of raw copper. My lungs forgot how to expand. I stared at the loop of the P, the sharp, decisive/crossing the T. Donnie did not put names in the back of the book as a warning. The book was a historical record of actions already approved. The ink was dry. The decision was absolute. I was a dead man balancing his own coffin's budget. I did not have time to process the terror. The heavy steel door at the top of the concrete stairs ground, the rusted hinges shrieking against the cinder block frame. I smoothly flipped the ledger back to the current week's deposits. I picked up the Mont Blanc pen. I kept my head down, my eyes fixed on the wet ink of the Cayman routing numbers. The heavy, measured footsteps descended the stairs. Leather soles striking concrete, Julian Moretti stepped into the harsh light of the basement. He wore a camel hair overcoat over a three-piece charcoal suit. He smelled of high-end juniper gin, imported cigarettes, and the cold, damp Chicago night. Julian was 33, possessed his uncle's sharp, predatory features, but lacked the old man's patience. His eyes were restless, constantly scanning, constantly calculating angles. He stopped at the edge of the stainless steel table, looking at the towering stacks of cash. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone, "you always look so comfortable in a cage." "The cage keeps the math pure, Julian," I replied. My voice was a flat, unreadable monotone. I did not look up from the ledger. I capped the pen and placed it parallel to the spine of the black book. Exact alignment. Julian reached out and picked up a stack of $100 bills. He flicked the rubber band, the snap loud in the confined space. "Uncle Donnie says we are light this week. The Port Authority bribes took a larger bite than projected. The unions renegotiated their hazard pay," I said, finally raising my eyes to meet his. "It is documented. The margins are tighter, but the net profit remains within the acceptable parameters of the third quarter." Julian smiled, but the muscles around his eyes remained completely rigid. He dropped the stack of bills back onto the table. It landed a few inches out of alignment with the rest of the wall. He was testing the boundaries. "Acceptable parameters. You talk like we're selling insurance, Arthur. We don't operate on acceptable parameters. We operate on absolute control." He leaned closer. The smell of juniper gin grew stronger. He planted his palms on the freezing steel table, his shadow falling over the black book. "I need an advance, Arthur," Julian murmured, his voice dropping into a register meant for conspiracies. 300,000, unrecorded. I have a private venture opening up in the garment district. The old man doesn't need to know the specifics until it bears fruit." I looked at the stack of bills he had displaced. I slowly reached out and pushed it back into perfect alignment with the rest. "You know the protocol, Julian. Every dollar in this room is spoken for. I cannot authorize unrecorded disbursements." Donatello audits the count. "Donatello is 65 years old and his memory is slipping," Julian countered, his jaw tightening. A micro-expression of absolute disdain flashed across his features. He looks at the bottom line. He doesn't look at the commas. 300 grand is a rounding error in this room. "Not in my ledger," I said softly. Julian stared at me. The air between us thickened, the tension vibrating like a plucked wire. He was trying to read my pulse, trying to find a crack in the dull, grey armor of the accountant. He didn't know that my blood was currently freezing in my veins, not because of his request, but because of the name written 20 pages deep under his left hand. "You're a loyal dog, Arthur," Julian said, his tone shifting, becoming dangerously soft. "But loyalty to a dying king is a bad investment. The crown is heavy. It's going to change heads soon. You should make sure you're standing on the right side of the room when the music stops." "I stand with the math," I replied. Julian chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He stood up straight, brushing invisible dust off the lapel of his overcoat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy gold Zippo lighter. He flipped the lid open and closed with his thumb. Clack, clack, clack. The sound was erratic, a stark contrast to the rhythmic hum of the money counter. "Math doesn't bleed, Arthur," Julian said, turning toward the stairs. "Make sure the books are closed out by midnight. We wouldn't want any outstanding debts left unresolved before the weekend." He paused at the first step, looking back over his shoulder. His eyes dropped to the black book. "Oh, and Arthur," he added, his voice slicing through the cold air. "Uncle Donnie mentioned you've been working too hard. He said it might be time for you to take a permanent vacation. Retire. Leave the numbers to someone with less." History. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked up the stairs, the heavy steel door slamming shut behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the concrete vault. I was alone again. The Zippo lighter was gone, but the erratic rhythm of its clicking remained trapped in my skull. Leave the numbers to someone with less history. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a confirmation. Julian knew about the last page. He probably orchestrated it. I looked down at the black book. My hands finally began to tremble, a microscopic vibration that originated deep in the marrow of my bones. I had spent 15 years laundering blood money, hiding corpses in balance sheets, and moving ghosts through offshore accounts. I thought my utility made me untouchable. I thought the machine could not run without its mechanic. I was wrong. I reached under the stainless steel table, my fingers brushing against the cold, taped grip of a snub-nosed, Bamwe-Tam revolver hidden beneath the lip of the metal. I had placed it there 7 years ago. I had never touched it since. Until tonight. The ledger was unbalanced, and I was the only one who could clear the debt. The heavy steel of the Bamwe-Tam snub-nose retained the freezing temperature of the basement. The electrical tape wrapped around its grip had cured into a hard, slick shell over the last 7 years. I pulled it free from the underside of the stainless steel table, the adhesive tearing away with a dry, ripping sound that briefly overpowered the hum of the currency counter. It weighed 21 ounces, fully loaded. I depressed the cylinder release latch. The cylinder swung out smoothly. 5 hollow-point copper-jacketed rounds sat in the chambers, the brass casings tarnished but functional. The faint, sharp scent of carbon and gun oil cut through the ozone and cocaine residue in the air. I snapped the cylinder back into place. The mechanical click was definitive. Final. I dropped the revolver into the deep right pocket of my charcoal overcoat. The fabric sagged immediately, the cold steel pressing a constant, heavy reminder against my thigh. I reached for the black book. The calfskin binding felt different under my fingertips now. It felt volatile. I placed it inside my cordovan leather briefcase, right next to the neatly banded stacks of the $2.4 million meant for the immediate operating fund. I closed the lid. The twin brass latches engaged with a sharp double snap. I picked up the briefcase. The handle was worn perfectly to the shape of my palm. I walked up the concrete stairs. My wingtips struck the steps in a steady, unhurried rhythm. The rusted hinges of the heavy steel door shrieked as I pushed it outward, stepping into the back corridor of the meatpacking plant. 2 associates were leaning against the blood-stained tile wall, Pauli and Silvio. They were built like heavy machinery and possessed the intellectual curiosity of cinder blocks. They smelled of stale garlic, cheap pepperoni, and the acrid smoke of unfiltered Pall Malls. Pauli tossed a cigarette butt onto the wet floor, crushing it beneath the heel of his boot. "Count good, Artie?" Pauli asked, his voice a thick, congested rumble. "The count is perfectly aligned with the projections," I said, my voice maintaining its standard, flat cadence. I did not break my stride. I walked past them, my eyes fixed on the heavy industrial double doors leading to the loading dock. "Julian said you were looking a little pale," Silvio muttered to my back. "Said you might need a long rest." I stopped. The air in the corridor was damp, smelling of raw meat and ammonia. I turned my head slowly, looking at Silvio over my shoulder. His jaw was slack. His hand was resting casually near the bulge under his windbreaker. I let my eyes drop to his hand, then back up to his face. I held the stare for exactly 3 seconds. The micro-muscle beneath Silvio's left eye twitched. He shifted his weight, pulling his hand away from his jacket to scratch his neck. "The numbers do not require rest," I said softly. I turned back and pushed through the double doors. The Chicago night hit me like a physical blow. The wind howling off Lake Michigan carried the freezing, bitter bite of impending snow. The alleyway was dark, illuminated only by a single, flickering halogen bulb above the loading bay. My car, a dark blue Lincoln Town car, was parked in the shadows next to a towering stack of wooden pallets. I unlocked the heavy door, threw the briefcase onto the passenger seat, and slid behind the wheel. The leather was ice cold. I keyed the ignition. The heavy farm engine turned over with a low, reliable growl. I did not drive to my apartment in the Gold Coast. A man marked for erasure does not return to a known perimeter. I drove west, plunging into the labyrinth of surface streets, putting distance between myself and the meatpacking plant. The digital clock on the dashboard glowed a harsh green. Mort, muy bon am. The heater slowly kicked in, blowing dry, warm air over my frozen knuckles. I needed a baseline. I needed to verify the structural integrity of the illusion Julian was building. If Julian had forced the binding of the Black Book and forged his uncle's heavy script to eliminate the old man's loyalists, he would need an external mechanism to execute the purge. Julian was a tactician of the boardroom, not the alleyway. He did not pull triggers himself. He subcontracted. And in the Moretti family, all high-level liquidations passed through one specific filter, Victor Kincaid. They called him the Ghost. He was an independent auditor of violence. When a capo got sloppy or a hitman left evidence, Victor was the man Donatello sent to balance the physical ledger. He was the one who cleaned up the mess, and sometimes he was the one who created it. If Marcus Thorne, the cleaner listed on the new page, had disappeared, Victor was the one who made him vanish. Victor operated out of a 24-hour diner tucked under the elevated train tracks in the loop. The neon sign outside sputtered, casting a sickly red glow across the wet pavement. I parked the Lincoln 2 blocks away, killing the headlights before sliding into an empty spot. I walked the remaining distance, the freezing wind slicing through my overcoat, the heavy weight of the BA. Balmy Tarm slapping a steady rhythm against my leg. The diner smelled of burnt coffee, industrial floor wax, and ancient fryer grease. It was completely empty, save for a solitary figure sitting in the back booth, his back to the wall, facing the entrance. Victor was a man stripped of all defining characteristics. He wore a grey suit that was entirely unremarkable. His hair was a neutral, thinning brown. His face was a study in aggressive anonymity. He sat perfectly still, a cup of black coffee steaming untouched in front of him. As I walked down the narrow aisle, the floorboards creaking under my shoes, Victor did not blink. He simply watched my hands. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him. The red vinyl squeaked in protest. Victor did not offer a greeting. He raised his coffee cup, his eyes entirely blank over the rim. He smelled faintly of unscented lye soap and surgical alcohol, a sterile void in a greasy room. "Arthur," Victor said. His voice was soft, resembling the rustle of dry leaves. "You are outside your jurisdiction. The basement is closed." "The books require continuous oversight," I replied, placing my hands flat on the scratched formica table. I kept my breathing even, inhaling the scent of his sterile soap. "There are discrepancies in the recent operational expenses. I am tracing a leak." Victor slowly lowered his cup. The saucer clicked against the table. "Leaks are a matter of plumbing. You deal in arithmetic." "Anthony Russo," I said, dropping the first name from the Black Book's execution list. I watched his face with absolute focus. His operation on the south side was highly profitable. His sudden departure leaves a significant gap in the quarterly projections. The police report attributes it to a territorial dispute. Victor stared at me. The silence stretched while a train roared overhead, shaking the diner, rattling the silverware in the metal bins. When the noise faded, Victor finally blinked. "Anthony was a gambler," Victor murmured. "He thought he could hold back a percentage of the sportsbook. The old man values transparency above all things. Anthony's math became cloudy. The territorial dispute was a convenient narrative for the authorities. The reality was an audit. He failed. I registered the phrasing. The old man values transparency. Victor was attributing the hit directly to Donatello, but Victor was a mercenary. His loyalties lay with the current signatory of the checks. And Marcus Thorne? I asked, pushing the second name across the table. Victor's eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. A micro-reaction. Marcus was an independent contractor. He took a union job last month. He left a shell casing at the scene. Sloppy work breeds external scrutiny. The family cannot afford external scrutiny. So he was audited as well, I stated. His contract was terminated permanently. Victor leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. The sleeves of his grey suit rode up, revealing a heavy steel dive watch. Why the sudden interest in the physical inventory, Arthur? You only care about the numbers. Dead men don't draw salaries. Dead men leave open accounts, I countered. I need to know who is authorizing the closeouts. Julian requested a $300,000 unrecorded advance tonight. He spoke of the crown changing heads. Victor sat back, sliding his hands into his lap, completely out of sight. My right hand supplely drifted toward the pocket of my overcoat, my fingers brushing the cold wool above the revolver. Julian is ambitious, Victor said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He looks at his uncle and sees a relic. He looks at the ledgers and sees restrictions. The old man's grip is slipping, Arthur. He forgets conversations. He repeats himself. Julian is simply preparing the ground for the inevitable transition. He is removing the rusted gears from the machine. Am I a rusted gear, Victor? The air in the diner turned to absolute ice. The hum of the refrigerators in the kitchen suddenly sounded deafening. Victor looked at my overcoat pocket, tracking the subtle shift in my posture. You are the accountant, Victor said smoothly. You belong to the book. Whoever holds the book holds you. But Julian does not like the way you look at him. He feels you are too loyal to the past. If the old man were to suddenly pass the torch, your position would become remarkably unstable. He was feeding me the narrative. He was confirming the false trail perfectly. Julian was orchestrating a silent coup, forging the Black Book to legitimize the elimination of anyone loyal to Donnie, and Victor was helping him clean the house. Julian had frayed the binding. Julian had written my name. Julian was waiting for the perfect moment to execute the final audit. I need to speak to Donatello, I said, standing up from the booth. The old man is at the estate, Victor said, not moving. But be careful, Arthur. If you bring him a problem he cannot understand, he might just burn the book to save himself the headache. I turned and walked out of the diner, the bell above the door chiming weakly in the bitter wind. The drive to the Moretti estate in Lake Forest took 40 minutes. The sprawling stone mansion sat behind wrought iron gates and a perimeter of ancient, towering oaks. The gates opened automatically as the Lincoln approached, recognizing the license plate. I drove up the sweeping circular driveway, the tires crunching softly on the crushed gravel. The interior of the estate was a testament to Donatello's reign. Heavy mahogany paneling, imported marble floors, and the overpowering scent of old money, beeswax, and expensive cigar smoke. Two men in dark suits patted me down at the front door. They missed the balmy tarm in the heavy overcoat entirely, too focused on my ribs and waistline. I was escorted to the library. The room was suffocatingly hot, a massive fire roaring in the stone hearth. Donatello Moretti sat in a high-backed leather wing-chair facing the flames. He wore a thick cashmere cardigan over a silk shirt. He looked frail. The flesh around his neck hung loose, and his liver-spotted hands rested weakly on the arms of the chair. He smelled of aged parmesan, expensive red wine, and the unmistakable, stale odor of failing kidneys. Arthur, Donnie rasped, his voice a shadow of the terrifying roar that had built this empire. He did not turn his head. He stared deeply into the fire. Come, sit. I walked across the Persian rug and sat in the chair opposite him. A heavy crystal decanter of Barolo sat on a silver tray between us, next to two empty glasses. The week is closed, Donatello, I said. 2.4 million, secured and documented. Donnie nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the decanter. The heavy crystal shook violently, clinking against the lip of the glass as he poured the dark red liquid. A few drops spilled onto the silver tray, looking exactly like fresh blood. 2.4, Donnie murmured. It used to be 5. When the city was alive, it was 5. Now everyone takes a piece. The politicians, the unions, my own blood. He handed me a glass. I took it, feeling the warmth of his trembling hand on the crystal. Julian asked for a $300,000 unrecorded advance tonight, I said, delivering the information without inflection. Donnie stopped moving. His hand hovered over the tray. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were milky, clouded by cataracts, but there was a sudden, sharp clarity deep within them, a terrifying spark of the old predator. Unrecorded, Donnie whispered. The words sounded like a curse in his mouth. He thinks because my hands shake, my mind is blind. He thinks he can bleed the stone before I am in the ground. He implied the transition of power is imminent, I added, turning the screw. Donnie let out a dry, rattling cough that shook his entire frame. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The smell of cedar from the fire mixed heavily with the scent of the spilled wine. My brother's boy? Donnie said softly. He has the ambition, but he lacks the patience. He wants to own the city, but he doesn't want to carry the weight of the book. He told me you were becoming a liability, Arthur. He told me your numbers were starting to favor the past. The trap was fully illuminated. Julian was actively poisoning the well, whispering in the old man's ear, building the justification for my execution. Julian had forced the binding of the Black Book. Julian had forged Donnie's handwriting. Julian had orchestrated the deaths of Anthony Russo and Marcus Thorne to isolate Donnie, and I was the final piece on the board. The logic was airtight. The sequence of events was perfectly aligned. The numbers do not favor anyone, Donatello, I said, taking a microscopic sip of the Barolo. It tasted of earth and iron. They only reflect the truth. Donnie opened his eyes and looked at me. I know they do, Arthur. That is why you are still breathing. Julian is a fool. He does not understand that without the accountant, the money is just paper, and the power is just an illusion. You keep the book safe. You understand? I always keep the book safe, I replied. Good, Donnie whispered, his chin dropping to his chest. He was exhausted. The brief flash of predatory clarity had vanished, replaced by the crushing fatigue of an old, dying man. Go home, Arthur. Leave the wolves to me. I stood up, placing the half-full glass of wine on the silver tray. I walked out of the library, the heat of the fire fading immediately as I stepped back into the freezing marble corridor. The drive back to my Gold Coast apartment was a blur of calculating probabilities. The false trail had completely convinced me. Julian was the architect. Julian was the enemy. I needed to eliminate Julian before he executed the final order in the Black Book. I had the gun. I had access to his schedule. The physical arithmetic of murder was relatively simple. It was the psychological geometry that complicated things. My apartment was a sterile, minimalist fortress on the 30th floor. White walls, black leather furniture, glass tables. No personal photographs. No clutter. It was a physical manifestation of a balanced ledger. I locked the deadbolt, engaged the secondary steel chain, and walked directly to my study. I placed the cordovan leather briefcase on the heavy oak desk. The brass latches snapped open loudly in the quiet room. I removed the Black Book and placed it directly under the high-intensity halogen desk lamp. I needed absolute confirmation. I needed to analyze the forgery. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a magnifying glass used for inspecting microscopic watermarks on stock certificates. I flipped the heavy parchment pages of the ledger, moving past the records of bribes, extortion, and offshore transfers, straight to the newly inserted page at the back. The 3 names stared up at me in the stark white light. Anthony Russo, Marcus Thorne, Arthur Pendleton. I leaned in, bringing the magnifying glass down to the thick, aggressive script. I examined the loop of the P in my name. I studied the sharp, definitive/crossing the T. Julian's handwriting was frantic, characterized by sharp, erratic angles and a light pressure on the page. He wrote quickly, discarding letters. But the script on this page was different. It was heavy. It was deeply grooved into the parchment, the pen pressing so hard it almost tore the fibers of the paper. It was deliberate, methodical. I pulled a stack of old memos from the bottom drawer, memos written by Donatello Moretti 5 years ago, before his hands began to tremble. I placed them next to the black book. I moved the magnifying glass back and forth. The pressure was identical. The curvature of the letters was an exact, forensic match. The slight hesitation at the end of the AA signature tick of Donatello's penmanship was present in both documents. Julian had not forged this page. The cold knot in my stomach tightened, turning into a jagged block of ice. I lowered the magnifying glass. My pulse, usually a steady 60 beats per minute, suddenly accelerated, a frantic drumming against my ribs. Donnie's hands shook so violently he could barely pour a glass of wine. He could not have written this page tonight, or yesterday, or even last week. The heavy, precise script meant this execution order had been written years ago. It had been held in reserve. But there was something else, a microscopic detail that shattered the entire architecture of my understanding. I leaned closer to the fresh page, bringing my nose almost to the parchment. The smell of the cedar oil was weak, yes, but the ink did not smell like the standard carbon-based black ink Donatello used in his fountain pen. It smelled very faintly of unscented lye soap and surgical alcohol. I froze. The ambient noise of the city outside my window completely vanished. The sterile air of my apartment suddenly felt toxic. Victor had not just cleaned up the bodies of Anthony Russo and Marcus Thorne. Victor was the one who managed the physical book when it wasn't in my possession. Victor had access to Donnie's old, untrembling handwriting samples. Victor possessed the absolute, surgical precision required to unstitch a wax binding, insert a forged page, and restitch it so perfectly that only a man who stared at it every single day would notice the microscopic fraying of the thread. Victor had placed the page. But why? If Victor wanted me dead, he would have shot me in the diner. He wouldn't leave a paper trail. Victor only created paper trails when he was building a narrative for an audit. The false trail wasn't Julian framing me to eliminate Donnie's loyalists. The false trail was Victor framing Donnie to provoke a war. Victor was manipulating Julian's ambition and Donnie's paranoia. He had planted the execution order knowing my absolute attention to detail would find it. He wanted me to see my name. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to believe Donnie or Julian had ordered my death, so I would take the Ba-Mui Tam out of my overcoat and eliminate one of them myself, destabilizing the entire family and leaving the Empire completely vulnerable to a hostile takeover. And I had walked right into the center of the crosshairs, carrying the very book they were trying to steal. I looked up from the desk, my eyes catching my reflection in the dark glass of the window. The accountant was dead. The man staring back at me was a target, and the ghost was already in the machine. The reflection in the dark glass of my 30th floor window did not belong to me anymore. The man staring back was a hollow shell, his perfectly tailored charcoal suit acting as a structural support for a collapsing nervous system. The surgical alcohol scent from the forged ink in the black book had crawled out of the heavy parchment and settled into the pores of my skin. Victor Kincaid, the ghost. I had spent my entire adult life organizing chaos into neat, manageable columns of red and black ink. I quantified risk. I mitigated exposure. But I had failed to account for the auditor who lived outside the ledger. I traced the sequence of events backward, letting the cold logic of mathematics dismantle the narrative I had been fed. Victor managed the disposal of Anthony Russo. Victor managed the erasure of Marcus Thorne. He had the bodies, which meant he had the leverage. He knew Julian was restless, pacing the edges of his uncle's fading empire like a starved hound. He knew Donnie was rotting from the inside out, his paranoia expanding to fill the vacuum left by his failing body. Victor had simply provided the friction. He unstitched the wax binding. He forged the heavy, deliberate script of a younger, stronger Donatello Moretti. He placed my name at the bottom of the list. He didn't do it to kill me. If Victor wanted me dead, I would have stopped breathing in the diner. He did it to weaponize me. Victor needed a catalyst to ignite the war between Julian and Donnie. He knew I was the only man who scrutinized the Black Book with microscopic precision. He knew I would find the forgery. He calculated my exact psychological trajectory. I would find the page, I would deduce my imminent execution, and I would seek out Julian or Donnie. Under the crushing weight of my own survival instinct, he expected me to draw the snub-nosed, Ba-Mui-Tam, and balance the equation by putting a bullet in the hare or the king. The accountant, the man who had never fired a weapon, would become the assassin that burned the Moretti family to the ground, and Victor would simply sweep the ashes into a dustpan and hand the keys of the city to whoever was paying him. The Russians, the cartel, the Irish, it didn't matter. The math was flawless, except I hadn't pulled the trigger. I had sat in Donnie's library, drank his bitter wine, and walked away. I had broken Victor's algorithm. A sharp, metallic click echoed through the absolute silence of my apartment. It was a microscopic sound, barely louder than a single drop of water hitting a porcelain sink, but in the sterile quiet of my soundproofed sanctuary, it was deafening. It came from the front door, the heavy brass deadbolt. My pulse spiked, a violent surge of adrenaline that turned the saliva in my mouth to ash. I did not move. I did not breathe. I kept my eyes fixed on the reflection in the window, watching the dark corridor behind my study. Another click, softer this time, the rhythmic mechanical manipulation of tumblers aligning inside a lock cylinder. Someone was picking the Medico high-security lock, someone with exceptional tools and infinite patience, not Julian's men. Pauli and Silvio would have kicked the door off its hinges and stormed in sweating garlic and cheap cologne. This was a surgical breach. This was Victor's contingency plan. Since I hadn't executed the hit on Donnie, I was no longer a useful catalyst. I was just a loose end, carrying $2.4 million and the physical map of the entire underworld. I reached toward the high-intensity halogen desk lamp. I did not turn it off. Plunging the room into darkness would only signal that I was aware of the intrusion. Instead, I carefully slid the black book into the cordovan leather briefcase. I snapped the twin brass latches shut. The sound was too loud. I winced, the muscles in my neck locking tight. I slipped my right hand into the deep pocket of my overcoat, which was draped over the back of my leather chair. My fingers wrapped around the cold, taped grip of the Ba-Mui-Tam revolver. I pulled it free, the weight of the steel anchoring me to the physical reality of the room. I thumbed the hammer back. The double-action sear engaged with a faint, deadly snick. I stepped away from the desk, moving across the white oak floorboards in my stocking feet. I had removed my wingtips when I entered. It was a habit of cleanliness, but tonight it was a tactical advantage. I pressed my back against the wall adjacent to the study door. The geometry of the apartment was simple. A long hallway led from the front door to the open-concept living area. The study was the first door on the right. Anyone moving toward the bedroom or the living room would have to pass my position. The secondary steel chain on the front door scraped against its track. A heavy thud followed as the door opened an inch and caught against the thick metal links. A low, metallic rasping sound drifted down the hallway. Bolt cutters. The steel chain snapped with a violent crack. The heavy oak door swung open, the hinges entirely silent. I tightened my grip on the Ba-Mui-Tam, pressing the cylinder against my thigh to stabilize my trembling hand. The air pressure in the apartment shifted, pulling the cold, damp draft of the hallway inside. Footsteps, two distinct sets. They did not wear heavy boots. They wore soft-soled tactical shoes that absorbed the impact of their weight. They moved with coordinated, sweeping fluidness. The smell preceded them. It wasn't the smell of street thugs. It was the sharp, chemical odor of gun oil, compressed neoprene, and the same unscented lye soap Victor Kincaid used. The first shadow elongated across the white oak floorboards, stretching into the study. He was moving slowly, his weapon raised, sweeping the corners. I held my breath until my lungs burned. I calculated the distance. 3 feet, 2 feet. The barrel of a suppressed submachine gun cleared the doorframe. Then a gloved hand, then a shoulder covered in matte black fabric. I did not hesitate. I did not close my eyes. I stepped directly into the open doorway, extending my right arm. The geometry was perfect. Point-blank range. I pulled the trigger. The roar of the .ba Mortarm in the confined hallway was an apocalyptic thunderclap. It shattered the sterile silence, sending a concussive shockwave that rattled the glass coffee table in the living room. The muzzle flash illuminated the corridor in a blinding strobe of yellow and orange. The hollow point round caught the first intruder in the throat, just below the jawline of his black tactical mask. The kinetic energy lifted him off his feet, his finger spasming on the trigger of his weapon. The suppressed submachine gun coughed wildly, thwip, 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 sending a spray of 9mm rounds blindly into the ceiling, showering us in white drywall dust. He crashed backward onto the floor, a thick, arterial spray of crimson painting the pristine white wall behind him. My ears rang with a high-pitched, agonizing whine. I did not stop moving. The arithmetic of survival dictated momentum. I stepped over the thrashing body of the first intruder, aiming the revolver down the hallway. The second man was already adjusting his firing stance, stepping out from the shadows near the coat closet. He was fast, his eyes locked onto my center mass over the sights of a suppressed pistol. I dropped to my left knee just as a bullet tore through the air, where my chest had been a fraction of a second earlier. It struck the oak doorframe behind me, sending sharp splinters of wood flying into my cheek. I felt a sudden, burning sting, but the pain registered as distant data. I fired twice from my kneeling position. Crack, crack. My first shot went wide, shattering the glass of a framed abstract print on the wall. My second shot found its mark. The heavy lead slug punched through the center of the intruder's chest. He grunted, a wet, heavy sound, and stumbled backward. But he did not fall. He wore Kevlar. He raised his weapon again, his movements sluggish but deliberate. I had 2 rounds left. I didn't aim for the chest. I aimed for the bridge of the nose, precisely where the black fabric of his mask met the tactical goggles. I squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell on an empty chamber, a terrifying, hollow click. I had miscounted. Or I had short-stroked the trigger in my panic. The cylinder had rotated to an empty slot. The intruder's pistol leveled at my face. The black eye of the suppressor was the only thing I could see. Time completely dilated. The ringing in my ears faded, replaced by the heavy, labored breathing of the man bleeding out on the floor beside me. I didn't try to pull the trigger again. I lunged forward, launching my entire body weight off my left knee. I drove the heavy steel barrel of the Mortarm directly upward, striking the underside of his wrist just as his finger tightened on the trigger. His pistol fired, the round tearing a hole through the sleeve of my pristine white shirt, grazing the skin of my bicep with a line of liquid fire. I crashed into him, driving my shoulder into his sternum. We fell backward, tangling in the heavy wool coats hanging in the closet. The smell of his sweat, sour and laced with adrenaline, hit my face. He was stronger than me, his muscles dense and conditioned. He twisted his body, pinning me against the wall, his left forearm pressing across my windpipe. The pressure was immediate and crushing. Black spots danced at the edge of my vision. He brought his right hand down, trying to angle the suppressed pistol toward my stomach. I dropped the empty Mortarm. It hit the floor with a dull thud. I drove my right thumb directly into his eye socket, pushing past the edge of the tactical goggles. He screamed. A roar, animalistic sound of pure agony, his grip on my throat loosening for a microsecond. I used the fraction of an inch to pivot my hips. I reached down to the floor, my fingers blindly scrambling over the white oak planks until I felt the heavy, cold metal of the bolt cutters they had dropped when they breached the door. I gripped one of the long, rubberized handles. I swung it upward with every ounce of terrifying, desperate leverage I possessed. The heavy iron head of the cutters slammed into the side of his skull with a sickening, wet crunch. The intruder went entirely rigid. His eyes rolled back beneath the goggles. He collapsed onto me, 200 pounds of dead weight, driving me to the floor. I shoved him off, gasping violently for air. The oxygen burned my crushed trachea, I rolled onto my hands and knees, my chest heaving, blood dripping from the splinter cut on my cheek onto the white oak floorboards. The pristine, balanced ledger of my life was completely destroyed. The apartment looked like a slaughterhouse, white walls smeared with red, drywall dust settling over the corpses like dirty snow. The smell of copper, voided bowels, and cordite was overwhelming. I sat back against the wall, pulling my knees to my chest. I looked at my hands. They were trembling uncontrollably, coated in a thick, sticky layer of dark blood. I had taken life. The absolute finality of the act was staggering. There was no erasure. There was no offshore account to hide the debt. The physical reality of murder was ugly, chaotic, and entirely devoid of the clean elegance I worshipped in my ledgers. The first intruder, the one I had shot in the throat, let out a final, bubbling sigh and went still. The silence rushed back in, heavier and more dangerous than before. A sharp, rhythmic buzzing vibrated against the floorboards. I froze, scanning the blood-soaked corridor. The sound was coming from the tactical vest of the man with the crushed skull. I crawled toward him, my body moving with a mechanical, detached stiffness. I reached into the upper pocket of his vest and pulled out a heavy, encrypted burner phone. The screen glowed harshly in the dim light. No caller ID. Just a blinking green icon. I pressed the accept button and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not speak. I regulated my breathing, forcing the jagged gasps back down into my chest. "The architecture is compromised," Victor's voice whispered through the speaker. It sounded like dry leaves scraping against concrete. "The accountant is proving to be more resilient than the projections indicated. The audit failed." "Victor," I rasped, my voice sounding like broken glass. A low, dry chuckle filtered through the line. "It was a stress test, Arthur. You found the anomaly in the book. You understood the geometry of the trap. You didn't shoot the king. I had to know if you were a spectator or a participant. You are covered in blood right now, aren't you?" "Why?" I demanded, the anger finally slicing through the shock. "Why burn the family? Why forge the ledger? The Moretti Empire is a rotting structure built on a cracked foundation," Victor said smoothly. "Donnie is dying. Julian is a reckless child who will attract the FBI within 6 months of taking the throne. The city requires stability. The syndicate from New York requires a clean port in Chicago. They are willing to pay a premium for a seamless transition, but a seamless transition requires the absolute eradication of the old guard." "All of them. You want the book?" I said, my eyes drifting to the study where my Cordovan briefcase sat under the halogen lamp. "I need the book, Arthur," Victor corrected. "The book is the deed to the city. It holds the account numbers, the routing codes, the blackmail on the alderman. Without the book, I hand New York a burning building. With the book, I hand them the keys to a kingdom. I assumed you would die tonight, and my men would retrieve it. But since you are still breathing, we must adjust the variables. I will burn it," I lied, my mind racing through the terrifying new landscape. "No, you won't," Victor said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute certainty. "You are an accountant. You worship the numbers. Destroying the book would be a sacrilege against everything you are. You will protect it. But you cannot run, Arthur. Julian's men are currently en route to your apartment. I called them 5 minutes ago. I told Paulie that you were the leak. I told him you were packing the weekly drop to flee the country. The floor beneath me felt like it was dissolving. Victor was a grandmaster playing a 3-dimensional board. He sent his own men to kill me and secure the book. But as a failsafe, he aimed Julian's muscle at me as well. If I survived the professionals, I would be slaughtered by the brutes. Julian will find 2 of your ghosts bleeding on my floor," I said, pulling myself up to my feet. "Julian will find 2 untraceable mercenaries. He will assume you hired them to cover your escape. He will tear the city apart to find you. And Donnie. When Donnie hears you have vanished with $2.4 million and the Black Book, he will empty the entire treasury to put your head on a spike. You are universally hunted, Arthur. You have no allies. You have no sanctuary." "What is the proposal, Victor?" I asked, wiping the blood off my cheek with the back of my ruined sleeve. If he was talking, he was negotiating. Bring the book to the old rail yard at the edge of the south side. Track 4. Come alone. Hand over the ledger, and I will give you a new identity, a chartered flight to Zurich, and you can keep the cash in the briefcase as a severance package. You disappear into the math. You survive. If you refuse, he hung up. The dial tone purred in my ear, a flat, monotonous hum. I dropped the burner phone onto the chest of the dead man. The digital clock on the microwave in the open kitchen read bar, Muy Lam, AM. Victor said Julian's men were en route. Paulie and Silvio drove a heavy Lincoln Navigator. From the meatpacking plant to the Gold Coast, breaking traffic laws, it was a 12-minute drive. I had exactly 7 minutes. I didn't bother changing my clothes. The blood on my shirt was a permanent stain on my soul. Changing the fabric wouldn't alter the reality. I walked into the study, grabbed the handle of the Cordovan briefcase, and felt the heavy weight of the cash and the black book inside. I walked back out, my eyes avoiding the twisted bodies in the hallway. I picked up the empty Ba Muy Tam from the floor. It was useless without ammunition, but I shoved it into my overcoat pocket anyway. A dead weight, a reminder of my failure to anticipate the board. I bypassed the front door. The elevators would be a death trap. If Paulie and Silvio were coming up, they would watch the digital floor indicators. I moved to the utility door in the kitchen that led to the service stairwell. I pushed the heavy fire door open and stepped into the concrete shaft. The air was cold and smelled of dust and industrial lubricant. I began the descent. 30th floor, 29th, 28th. My legs burned, the adrenaline crash threatening to turn my muscles to lead. I focused entirely on the rhythmic slap of my stocking feet against the concrete steps, down and down, into the abyss. As I reached the 10th floor, the sound of heavy boots slamming against the stairs echoed up the shaft. They were coming up from the lobby. Paulie's harsh, wheezing breath was audible even from 3 floors away. "Check the service elevator. Silvio, you take the stairs," Paulie's voice roared, echoing off the cinder blocks. I froze on the landing of the 9th floor. I was trapped. I couldn't go down. I couldn't go back up. I looked at the heavy fire door marked Cheen. I pulled the handle. It was locked from the stairwell side. A standard fire code violation in these high-rises. The footsteps were getting louder. 8th floor. The heavy, metallic clang of a gun scraping against the concrete railing. I dropped the briefcase. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the empty Ba Muy Tam. I gripped it by the barrel, turning the heavy steel grip outward like a hammer. I stepped into the darkest corner of the landing, pressing my body flat against the cold cinder block wall. I stopped breathing. I slowed my heart rate through sheer, terrifying force of will. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold. The stairwell door on the 8th floor banged open, then slammed shut. Silvio was moving fast, skipping steps, his heavy breathing a wet, ragged rhythm. He rounded the corner of the landing between 8 and 9. He was holding a sawed-off shotgun, his eyes wide and dilated, fueled by whatever powder he had snorted in the Navigator. He didn't look in the corner. He looked straight up the shaft toward the 10th floor. As he stepped onto the 9th floor landing, his back completely exposed, I stepped out of the shadows. I slowly heavy steel grip of the Ba Muy 3, beat my palm down on the base of his skull with every ounce of kinetic force my body could generate. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud. Silvio dropped instantly, crumbling like a puppet with its strings cut. His finger jerked on the trigger of the shotgun as he fell. The weapon discharged. The blast was deafening in the concrete echo chamber. A cloud of buckshot tore into the cinder block wall, showering the landing in concrete shrapnel. "Silvio!" Paulie yelled from below, his heavy boots pounding up the stairs. "What the fuck is going on?" I didn't wait. I grabbed Silvio's collar, hauling his unconscious, bleeding body into the corner. I picked up the sawed-off shotgun. It was heavy, smelling sharply of sulfur and burnt powder. I racked the pump. The mechanical clack was the universal language of immediate death. I grabbed the handle of the briefcase, holding it tight in my left hand, the shotgun leveled in my right. I moved to the edge of the landing, looking down the stairwell. Paulie rounded the corner, his heavy, Lam automatic raised. He looked up, his eyes locking onto the twin barrels of the shotgun pointing directly at his face. He froze. The wheezing breath caught in his throat. He looked at the blood covering my shirt, the wild, dead stare in my eyes, and the body of his partner bleeding in the corner. The accountant was gone. The man standing on the stairs was a demon born from the ink of a forged ledger. "Artie," Paulie whispered, his voice cracking. Julian said. "Julian is a fool," I stated, my voice echoing coldly down the shaft. "Drop the gun, Paulie, or I will paint the walls with you." Paulie was a survivor. He calculated the odds. Lam against a sawed-off shotgun holding the high ground. The math was not in his favor. He slowly opened his hand, letting the heavy automatic clatter against the concrete steps. He raised his hands, stepping backward. "I'm walking away, Artie," Paulie said, keeping his eyes locked on the barrel. "I didn't see nothing. Go back to Julian," I commanded. "Tell him the book is closed." Paulie turned and scrambled down the stairs, his heavy boots echoing rapidly until the sound faded into the lobby. I stood on the landing, the heavy shotgun trembling in my hand. I had breached the point of no return. I was actively at war with the entire Moretti family, and the ghost was waiting for me in the rail yards to execute the final maneuver. The ledger had to be balanced, but I would not hand the book to Victor Kincaid. I would not buy a flight to Zurich and disappear into the ether while the men who murdered my reality inherited the city. Victor wanted to use the Black Book to hand the empire to New York. He believed I worshipped the numbers. He believed I would preserve the parchment above all else. He had miscalculated. The book was not just a record of assets, it was a record of sins, and it was time to burn the house down to ensure the wolves burned with it. I slung the shotgun under my overcoat. I picked up the briefcase. I bypassed the lobby and exited through the sub-basement parking garage, stepping out into the freezing, howling Chicago wind. The city was a sprawling, dark grid of hostility, but for the first time in my life, I saw the lines clearly. I was no longer tracing the margins. I was writing the final chapter. The heavy farm engine of Paulie's stolen Lincoln Navigator idled with a deep, guttural vibration that resonated through the soles of my stocking feet. I had abandoned my ruined wingtips in the sub-basement of my apartment building, and the cold rubber of the gas pedal pressed directly against my toes. The interior of the SUV was a sensory assault. It reeked of stale garlic, cheap synthetic pine air freshener, and the sour, lingering sweat of panic Paulie had left behind. The digital dashboard clock glowed a harsh, unyielding green. Bonmwe AM. The city of Chicago was dead, buried under a freezing, horizontal sheet of sleet that battered the reinforced windshield like thousands of microscopic hammers. The wipers dragged across the glass with a heavy, rubbery groan, smearing the yellow sodium light of the street lamps into long, greasy streaks. I gripped the thick leather steering wheel with my left hand. My right hand rested securely on the stock of Silvio's sawed-off shotgun, the cold steel barrel lying flat against my thigh. The cordovan leather briefcase sat on the passenger seat, anchored by the seatbelt. $2.4 million, and the architecture of an empire, completely secured by a thin strap of nylon. I turned off the main thoroughfare, the heavy tires crunching violently over the frozen, pothole-scarred asphalt of the South Side Industrial District. The railyard was a massive, sprawling graveyard of rusted steel and forgotten logistics. Towering rows of corrugated shipping containers formed an artificial canyon, swallowing the faint glow of the city skyline. I killed the headlights. The Navigator plunged into absolute darkness, guided only by the ambient, sickly orange glow of the distant security towers. I navigated the maze of tracks from memory. Track 4 was located at the deepest edge of the yard, bordering the black, frozen expanse of the Calumet River. The smell of the river seeped through the climate control vents, a dense, heavy odor of rotting kelp, diesel fuel, and oxidized iron. It was the smell of the end of the line. I eased the heavy SUV to a silent stop behind a decaying boxcar. I cut the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, a crushing, physical weight pressing against the glass. The heater died. and the freezing temperature of the Chicago night immediately began to penetrate the cabin, biting through my ruined, blood-stained white silk shirt. I did not shiver. My core temperature felt entirely disconnected from my environment, running on the pure, toxic fuel of adrenaline and absolute clarity. I reached over and unbuckled the briefcase. I grabbed the handle. I slid the sawed-off shotgun deep into the inner pocket of my heavy charcoal overcoat, letting the heavy barrel rest flush against my ribs. I kept my right hand inside the coat, my index finger resting parallel to the trigger guard. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the sleet. The ice immediately soaked through my socks, sending a shockwave of cold up my calves, but I ignored it. I walked around the edge of the rusted boxcar, my footsteps entirely silent on the frozen mud. Track 4 was illuminated by a single, high-intensity halogen work light powered by a portable generator. The generator hummed a low, erratic mechanical rhythm, spitting blue exhaust fumes into the freezing air. Standing in the center of the stark white circle of light was Victor Kincaid, the ghost. He wore a dark, heavy wool trench coat that absorbed the light, making him look like a tear in the fabric of the night. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting deep in his pockets. The sleet bounced off his neutral, unremarkable face. He did not look cold. He did not look anxious. He looked like an auditor waiting for a late appointment. I stepped into the edge of the light. The frozen gravel crunched softly beneath my feet. Victor slowly turned his head. His eyes locked onto mine. He did not register the blood drying on my cheek or the tattered state of my clothing. His gaze dropped immediately to the cordovan leather briefcase in my left hand. Punctuality is a rare virtue in our line of work, Arthur. Victor's voice drifted through the sleet, soft and entirely devoid of friction. He smelled faintly of the ozone generated by the work light, mixed with his signature sterile lye soap. I am pleased you survived the stress test. It proves my assessment of your utility was accurate. The audit is closed, Victor, I said. My voice was a flat, baritone rasp that barely carried over the hum of the generator. I stopped 10 feet away from him, keeping my body angled slightly to shield the bulge of the shotgun under my overcoat. I have the ledger. I have the currency. Execute the transition. Victor smiled. It was a terrifying expression, a mere stretching of the facial muscles that never reached his dead, empty eyes. He slowly pulled his right hand from his pocket. He was holding a small black remote detonator. He pressed a button. High above us, on the rusted catwalk of a towering grain silo overlooking the track, a red laser sight flickered to life. The beam cut through the sleet, a solid ruby-colored wire that terminated directly in the center of my chest. Insurance, Arthur, Victor murmured, gesturing vaguely toward the silo. You prove to be remarkably lethal in a confined space. I cannot afford variable outcomes in an open environment. The man on the catwalk is a specialist from New York. He does not miss. Keep your hands exactly where they are. I did not look up at the laser. I kept my eyes entirely fixed on Victor's face. The red dot burned against my ruined shirt, a microscopic sun promising instantaneous death. I regulated my breathing. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. You brought New York into the city before you secured the book, I stated, analyzing the tactical error. That is a premature allocation of resources. If I had burned the ledger in my apartment, you would have delivered an empty vault to a very unforgiving syndicate. I calculate probabilities, Arthur, Victor replied, taking a slow step forward. The gravel crunched under his heavy boots. The probability of an accountant destroying his life's work is absolute 0. You are defined by the ink. You are defined by the balance. You cannot destroy the Black Book, because without it, Arthur Pendleton ceases to exist. You are just a man in a blood-soaked suit standing in the freezing rain. He was attempting to dismantle my psychological foundation. He wanted to project absolute control over the geometry of the negotiation. I tightened my grip on the handle of the briefcase. Julian is looking for me, I said smoothly, shifting the variables. Polly knows I am alive. Polly knows I possess the heavy assets. The entire South Side crew will be mobilizing. You cannot hold a quiet auction with New York. when the local hierarchy is actively hunting the merchandise. Victor stopped. The smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, bureaucratic efficiency. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy silver Zippo lighter. It was the exact same lighter Julian had been clicking in the basement of the meatpacking plant. Victor flipped the lid open with a sharp, metallic clack. He struck the flint. The yellow flame illuminated the hollows of his cheeks. "Julian is no longer a variable," Victor said softly. He snapped the lighter shut and tossed it onto the frozen gravel. It landed at my feet. The heavy gold casing was smeared with something dark and sticky. The air in my lungs turned to frost. I stared at the lighter. The implications rippled through the architecture of my mind. "Julian went to his penthouse after you left the basement," Victor explained, his voice taking on the cadence of a professor lecturing a slow student. He was celebrating his anticipated ascension. He drank heavily. A tragedy occurred. His private elevator malfunctioned. The cables snapped. He fell 30 stories. The police are currently establishing a perimeter. It will be ruled a catastrophic mechanical failure. The hair is dead, Arthur. The brutal, sweeping efficiency of the ghost was staggering. He hadn't just forged a page to start a war. He had actively decapitated the Moretti family in the span of 3 hours. Julian was dead. Anthony was dead. Marcus was dead. And Donatello was sitting alone in a heavily guarded estate, completely unaware that his bloodline had been severed and his city had already been sold. "And Donnie?" I asked, keeping my voice completely hollow. "The old man is isolated," Victor said, gesturing toward the briefcase. "Without his nephew, without his capos, and without his money, he is just a dying animal in a very large cage. New York will walk into the estate tomorrow morning and present him with a retirement package he cannot refuse. The transition is 99% complete. You hold the final 1% in your left hand. Hand me the book, Arthur. I have a Gulfstream fueled and waiting at Midway. You hand me the leather, you keep the cash, you walk away." I looked at Victor. I looked at the red laser dot resting perfectly over my sternum. The narrative was flawless. The logic was an impenetrable fortress. Victor had audited the entire Underworld and balanced the equation perfectly. But I was the accountant. I existed to find the microscopic errors in the margins. I slowly raised the briefcase, resting it against my thigh. I did not reach for the latches. I maintained absolute stillness. "There is a discrepancy in your ledger, Victor," I said. The words hung in the freezing air, sharp and heavy as cracked glass. Victor frowned. The micro-muscle in his jaw tightened. He did not like deviations from his projections. "There are no discrepancies. The math is absolute." "The ink," I said softly. Victor went entirely still. The rhythmic hum of the generator seemed to fade, consumed by the crushing pressure building in the space between us. "The ink on the forged page," I continued, my voice gaining a terrible, cold momentum. "You used a carbon base, but it carried the distinct chemical signature of your surgical lye soap. It was a microscopic cross-contamination. You are the most meticulous cleaner in Chicago. You do not leave chemical signatures by accident. You left it on purpose. You wanted me to know you forged the page." Victor stared at me. The laser on my chest did not waver. The sniper was a machine, waiting for the signal. "You orchestrated this entire night," I said, stepping forward. The laser tracked my movement perfectly, remaining locked on my heart. "You killed Julian. You killed Anthony. You isolated the old man. If you had the tactical capability to eliminate the entire upper echelon of the Moretti family in a single night, you never needed me to start a war. You never needed me to shoot Julian or Donnie. You had the ghost operatives to do it yourself." I took another step. The distance between us closed to 6 feet. I could smell the ozone on his coat. "You didn't forge the book to weaponize me," I stated, the final, terrifying piece of the architecture clicking into place. "You forged the book to flush me out. You needed me to run. You needed me to pack the briefcase and leave the vault." Victor's eyes narrowed into dark, calculating slits. He did not deny it. He waited. "But why?" I asked, the pressure in my chest mounting until it felt like my ribs were fracturing. Why go through the elaborate psychological torture? Why send assassins to my apartment if you just wanted the book? You managed the physical ledger when I was away. You could have stolen the black book from the basement vault at any point in the last 5 years. You had the access. You had the codes. The silence stretched. A distant train horn mourned into the night, a long, hollow sound that vibrated against the rusted shipping containers. Victor let out a slow, measured breath. A plume of white vapor plumed from his lips. He tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the checkmate of my logic. "You are correct, Arthur," Victor whispered, his voice dropping all pretense of bureaucratic detachment. "I could have taken the book from the vault on any given Tuesday, but the book in the vault is worthless to me, and it is worthless to New York." My fingers tightened on the handle of the briefcase. The leather creaked loudly. "The black book is a masterpiece," Victor continued, his eyes drifting down to the Cordovan leather. "Donatello is a brute, but he understands security. He knows that physical ledgers can be seized. He knows that paper can be burned. So, he built a failsafe, a ghost in the machine." Victor looked back up into my eyes. The sterile void in his expression was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp hunger. "The routing numbers in the black book," Victor said slowly, pronouncing every syllable with agonizing precision. "The Cayman accounts, the Delaware shells, the Swiss depositories, they are all encrypted. The numbers written on those parchment pages are not the actual account numbers. They are a cipher, a mathematical algorithm designed to look like standard banking data to anyone who doesn't possess the key." The ground beneath me seemed to shift, turning into loose sand. "Donatello didn't write the cipher," Victor said, stepping entirely into my personal space. "Donatello can barely balance a checkbook. He hired a prodigy 15 years ago, a man who worshipped numbers, a man who lived entirely inside his own mind. You wrote the cipher, Arthur. You created the algorithm that hides $2 billion of Moretti assets, the missing link, the Mutfentram anomaly that had completely blinded me. I wasn't the custodian of the Black Book. I was the Black Book. You never wrote the decryption key down. Clear it," Victor said, his voice vibrating with suppressed frustration. "We watched you. We tore your apartment apart tonight looking for a secondary ledger. There is nothing. You memorize the shifts. You calculate the decryption algorithm entirely in your head every time you execute a transfer. You are the only living entity who knows how to translate the ink into actual currency." The chokehold was absolute. I couldn't breathe. The oxygen in the air had turned to solid glass. I finally understood the terrifying genius of Victor Kincaid. He didn't want the leather tome in my briefcase. The book was just the lock. I was the key. He forged my name on the execution list to shatter my loyalty to the Moretti family. He sent the assassins to terrorize me, to force me to pack up my life and run into his waiting arms. He needed me alive, isolated, and completely dependent on him. He needed to hand the New York syndicate the accountant, not the ledger. "The flight to Zurich is real, Arthur," Victor said, his tone softening into a dangerous, serpentine purr. "But you won't be retiring. You will be going to work for a new board of directors. You will decrypt the assets, transfer the wealth to the New York accounts, and then, perhaps, you will earn your permanent vacation. If you refuse, the man on the catwalk puts a bullet through your spine. You won't die, but you will spend the rest of your life in a wheelchair, in a windowless room, translating numbers until your brain rots. Hand me the briefcase, and get in the van." A black, unmarked panel van suddenly rolled out from behind the grain silo, its engine entirely silent, moving like a hearse on electric tires. It stopped 10 yards away, the side door sliding open to reveal a dark, empty cavity. I was trapped in a perfect, inescapable mathematical loop. Every variable had been controlled. Every exit was blocked. The laser burned against my chest. The ghost stood inches away, waiting to claim his prize. I had spent 15 years building a fortress of numbers, and I had locked myself inside. I looked at the briefcase in my left hand. I looked at the black van. I looked at the red dot on my heart. Then I looked at Victor. "You made one miscalculation in your algorithm, Victor," I whispered, my voice completely devoid of fear, devoid of panic. The absolute freezing calm of the ledger returned to me. Victor frowned. "There are no miscalculations. You assumed I packed the black book." I released my grip on the handle. The cordovan leather briefcase dropped from my hand. It hit the frozen gravel with a heavy, unceremonious thud. The twin brass latches, which I had intentionally left unfastened when I pulled it from the navigator, popped entirely open. The lid flipped back. The harsh white light of the halogen generator flooded the interior of the case. There were no neatly banded stacks of $100 bills. There was no $2.4 million, and there was no heavy calfskin tome smelling of cedar oil. The briefcase was packed entirely with dense, heavy blocks of seaborne plastic explosive. Embedded in the center of the pail, clay-like bricks, was a rudimentary digital timer wired to a blasting cap. The red LED display was not counting down. It was linked to a dead man's switch I had hastily ripped from the timing mechanism of a commercial meat freezer in the sub-basement. The red light on the detonator was solid. It was armed. Victor's eyes widened. The micro-expression of pure, unadulterated terror shattered his sterile mask. He recognized the architecture of the bomb instantly. He looked from the seaborne up to my face. "I didn't bring the book, Victor," I said, my voice rising over the hum of the generator. "I brought the audit." I ripped my right hand out from under my charcoal overcoat. I did not draw the shotgun to aim at Victor. I aimed the sawed-off barrel directly down at the open briefcase resting at my feet. The red laser on my chest danced wildly as the sniper on the catwalk panicked, realizing the geometry of the situation had completely inverted. If the sniper shot me, my finger would pull the trigger of the shotgun as I fell. The buckshot would strike the blasting cap. The seaborne would detonate, instantly vaporizing me, Victor, and the entire immediate grid of Track 4. I had neutralized the sniper. I had neutralized the ghost. I had balanced the equation with the threat of absolute, mutual annihilation. "Arthur, stop!" Victor yelled, taking a desperate step backward, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. The control was gone. The Grandmaster was staring at a board covered in gasoline. "You kill us both. You burn everything." "Math doesn't bleed, Victor," I quoted, staring down the barrel of the shotgun at the explosive payload. "But it definitely burns." The silence that followed was the heaviest sound in the world. The generator hummed. The sleet hammered against the rusted steel containers. The laser dot trembled violently on my chest. The standoff was a fragile, molecular bond waiting to snap. But as I stared at Victor, watching the absolute panic consume the architect of my destruction, the final, fatal missing link of the entire night finally revealed itself to me. A detail so perfectly hidden in plain sight that it stopped my heart. Victor had said Donatello hired me 15 years ago. Victor said Donatello knew I wrote the cipher. But 15 years ago, Donatello Moretti was in federal prison on a racketeering charge. He didn't run the family. His brother did. Julian's father. Donatello didn't hire me. Donatello didn't know about the cipher. There was only one man alive who knew I held the algorithm in my head. There was only one man who could have given Victor the intel to orchestrate this entire massacre, and that man wasn't dead in a broken elevator. The red laser dot rested precisely over my sternum, a microscopic, burning sun in the freezing sleet. I stared at Victor, watching the frantic, rapid calculation behind his dead eyes as he processed the seaborne in the briefcase. He was trapped in the blast radius. The Grandmaster had lost control of the board, but my attention was no longer on the ghost. The architecture of the conspiracy had finally completed itself in my mind, locking into place with a terrifying, absolute clarity. Donatello Moretti did not hire me 15 years ago. He was serving a federal sentence at Marion. The man who recruited me, the man who recognized the utility of a mathematical prodigy and commissioned the encrypted cipher for the Black Book, was his brother, Julian's father, and Julian inherited his father's archives. "The elevator didn't fall, did it, Victor?" I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the portable generator. Victor's jaw locked. He did not answer. He kept his eyes fixed on the sawed-off shotgun, aimed at the explosive payload. A sharp, metallic scrape echoed from the black panel van. The sliding door, already open to the night, groaned slightly as weight shifted inside the dark cavity. A leather shoe stepped out onto the frozen gravel. Then, a camel hair overcoat. The freezing wind suddenly carried the sharp, unmistakable scent of imported juniper gin and expensive tobacco, slicing clean through the ozone and the smell of the rotting river. Julian Moretti stepped into the stark white circle of the halogen worklight. He did not look dead. He looked immaculate. His charcoal suit was perfectly pressed, his hair slicked back against the driving sleet. He held a suppressed Heckler, Koch USP in his right hand, the weapon hanging loosely at his side. He stopped exactly 10 feet away, standing just behind Victor's right shoulder. "I told you he was too rigid, Victor," Julian said, his smooth baritone completely devoid of panic. He looked at the open briefcase filled with explosives, then up at my face. He smiled, a thin, arrogant stretching of his lips. "You treat him like a variable. I told you he is a constant. He doesn't bend. He breaks." "You are inside the blast radius, Julian," Victor hissed, not turning his head, his body entirely rigid. "Tell your sniper to stand down. If he twitches, we all vaporize." "He won't pull the trigger," Julian said, taking another step forward, closing the distance. He waved his free hand dismissively. "Look at him, Victor. Look at the accountant. He is a creature of preservation. He calculates risk. Suicide is a 100% loss of assets. He worships the bottom line. He won't zero out his own ledger." Julian looked directly into my eyes. The pupil dilation was minimal. He was operating on pure, sociopathic confidence. "It was a beautiful design, Arthur," Julian murmured, the sleet catching on the collar of his coat. The old man was suffocating the family. "The New York Syndicate offered me a seat at the commission if I delivered Chicago on a silver platter, but I needed the cipher. I knew you had it memorized. My father left notes, but you are too loyal. You would have let me torture you to death before you gave up the algorithm. I needed you broken. I needed you to believe the entire world was hunting you, so you would run straight into the extraction team. Victor played his part perfectly, but you had to be difficult. I kept the barrel of the shotgun pointed down at the Seaborn. My breathing was a slow, mechanical hiss through my teeth. The laser dot on my chest remained completely static. "The execution order in the Black Book," I stated, verifying the final data point. "I wrote it," Julian confessed, his smile widening. "I spent 3 months practicing my uncle's heavy script. Victor procured the vintage ink. We planted it, knowing your obsessive little eyes would find the frayed thread. We sent the cleaners to your apartment to push you out the door. It was a masterpiece of psychological engineering. And now, here we are, the end of the line." He raised his suppressed pistol, aiming it at my head. "The math is very simple now, Arthur," Julian said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You surrender the cipher and you live. You pull that trigger and you die. The instinct for survival is the oldest equation in the human brain. You will not choose death." The sleet battered my face. The cold had completely numbed my fingers, but my grip on the heavy steel of the shotgun was absolute. Julian had calculated my psychological profile based on 15 years of observation. He saw a man who hid behind steel doors, counting other men's money. He saw a coward, dressed in tailored wool. He failed to understand that an accountant does not fear zero. An accountant only fears an unbalanced book. "You are correct, Julian," I said, my voice dropping an octave, resonating with a terrifying, hollow calm. "I am a creature of preservation. I do not destroy assets." I slowly lifted my chin. I looked past Julian, past Victor, staring into the dark, frozen expanse of the Rayliad. "Which is why I did not burn the Black Book," I said. Julian's smile faltered. "A micro-fraction of an inch." His eyes darted to the briefcase filled with Seaborn, then back to my face. "The physical ledger," I continued, the words striking the air like hammer blows. The untreated calf skin, the parchment. I didn't destroy it. I mailed it. Victor's head snapped toward me, the sterile mask completely shattering. I placed it in a secure courier package 3 hours ago. I lied with absolute, chilling conviction. It is currently en route to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Organized Crime Division at the Dirksen Federal Building. It will arrive at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The oxygen vanished from the circle of light. The scent of juniper gin soured instantly, replaced by the sharp, acidic reek of human terror. "You're lying," Julian breathed, his hand trembling slightly, the suppressed pistol wavering. "I am the accountant," I stated flatly. "I do not lie. I balance the accounts. The physical book contains the raw data, the bribes, the names, the dates. Without the cipher, the FBI cannot access the offshore billions. But they can read the operational history of the Moretti family. They can read your name, Julian. They can read Victor's name. The empire is dead. New York will not buy a syndicate that is currently being raided by the federal government. You have nothing to sell." The architecture of Julian's grand design collapsed in real time. I watched his eyes dilate rapidly. I watched the realization hit Victor like a physical blow. The $2 billion hidden in the cipher was entirely worthless if the physical evidence of their existence was sitting on a federal agent's desk. "Kill him," Julian shrieked, his voice cracking, entirely losing the smooth, practiced baritone. He looked up at the grain silo, screaming at the sniper. "Take the shot! Take the shot!" The red laser dot on my chest flared brilliantly. I did not pull the trigger on the Seaborn. I executed the final geometric shift. I violently twisted my torso to the left, dropping my center of gravity entirely. At the exact same microsecond, I ripped the barrel of the sawed-off shotgun upward, aiming not at Julian, not at Victor, but directly at the high-intensity halogen work, light resting on the generator. I squeezed the trigger. The 12-gauge blast was a deafening, concussive roar that tore the freezing night in half. The buckshot shredded the heavy glass and the internal filament of the halogen bulb. The stark white circle of light instantly vanished. The Railiad plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. A high-velocity rifle round cracked through the space where my chest had been a fraction of a second earlier. The sound was a terrifying, supersonic whip crack. The heavy-caliber bullet slammed into the open briefcase at my feet, obliterating the plastic casing of the detonator and burying itself deep into the inert clay of the Seaborn, rendering the explosive entirely dead. I hit the frozen gravel, rolling aggressively to my right, letting the momentum carry me under the rusted undercarriage of the decaying boxcar. The smell of oxidized iron and frozen mud filled my nose. Chaos erupted in the darkness. "Where is he?" Julian screamed, his voice echoing blindly off the corrugated shipping containers. The suppressed thwip-thwip-thwip of his pistol cut through the air, firing wildly into the void where I had just been standing. "Get down, you idiot," Victor roared. Another supersonic crack echoed from the silo. The sniper, blinded by the sudden destruction of his primary light source, was firing blindly at the muzzle flashes of Julian's pistol. A wet, heavy thud sounded 10 feet away, followed by a sharp, gargling gasp. The smell of atomized blood and peppermint mouthwash hit the freezing air. Victor. The sniper had neutralized his own employer. I lay perfectly still on my stomach beneath the heavy steel axles of the boxcar. My cheek rested against the frozen ice. I racked the pump of the shotgun. The mechanical clack-clack was incredibly loud in the sudden, echoing silence that followed Victor's collapse. "Arthur!" Julian's voice trembled in the pitch black. He was close, less than 15 feet away, crouching somewhere near the front tires of the panel van. "Arthur, listen to me. We can fix this. We can intercept the package. I have people inside the bureau. We can still pull the money." He was bargaining with a ghost. He was trying to negotiate a balance sheet that had already been closed. I did not speak. I closed my eyes, relying entirely on the auditory and olfactory data of the environment. The sleet hitting the steel, the low hum of the generator, the smell of the river, and then the faint, desperate sound of a leather shoe shifting against the frozen gravel. The sharp, Unmistakable scent of juniper gin drifting on the wind, coming from my 2 o'clock position. I rolled out from under the boxcar, rising to a crouch in the absolute darkness. I raised the heavy shotgun, anchoring the stock firmly against my ribs. I aimed at the center of the juniper scent. "I am the accountant, Julian," I whispered into the freezing void. A muzzle flash erupted from Julian's position, illuminating his terrified, pale face for a microscopic fraction of a second. The bullet whined past my left ear, shattering the wood of the boxcar behind me. I pulled the trigger. The massive burst of flame from the sawed-off barrel painted the rail yard in a blinding strobe of violent orange. The heavy buckshot caught Julian dead center. The kinetic force lifted him backward, slamming his body against the side of the black panel van with a hollow, metallic boom. He slid down the side of the vehicle, his tailored overcoat catching on the door hinge. He hit the gravel and did not move. The echo of the shotgun blast rolled out across the frozen Calumet River, slowly fading into the relentless, driving hiss of the sleet. The silence returned. Heavy, absolute, final. I stood in the darkness for a full minute, listening for any movement from the catwalk on the grain silo. Nothing. The sniper was a professional. With his ground team eliminated and his target lost in the dark, the arithmetic of his contract dictated immediate extraction. He was already gone. I walked over to the side of the van. Julian was a crumpled mass of shadow and ruined fabric. I did not check his pulse. The smell of copper was overwhelming, completely drowning out the gin. I turned and walked back to the center of the track. I knelt on the frozen gravel and reached into the ruined briefcase. My fingers dug past the shredded plastic of the dead detonator and the heavy blocks of seaborne. Deep at the bottom, wrapped securely in a thick, waterproof layer of heavy industrial plastic, was the black book. I had not mailed it. I had not burned it. I had kept it exactly where it belonged. Under the absolute protection of the accountant, I pulled the heavy calfskin tome free. It weighed exactly 3.2 pounds. The smell of cedar oil seeped through the plastic, a comforting, familiar anchor in the chaos. I stood up. I left the briefcase, the explosives, and the $2.4 million lying in the frozen mud. Cash was a liability. Cash left a trail. The cipher was the only currency that mattered now. I turned my back on the rail yard, on the bodies, and on the ashes of the Moretti Empire. I walked toward the edge of the river, disappearing into the falling snow. The city of Chicago was a blank ledger waiting for a new entry, and I held the only pen. There would be no retirement in Zurich. There would be no peace. There is only the math, the cold, and the endless, uncompromising necessity of balancing the blood.